Good afternoon or early evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome everyone at today's at this panel, which is devoted to the future of the euro as a currency, the future of the eurozone. As we can see, we have a very strong competition with Brexit, which after the European elections became such an exciting, even though it's a very depressive and destructive topic, I must say, but hopefully you will enjoy it anyway. So I would like to first introduce our panelists. I will start on my right-hand side. Mr. Jean-Pierre Landau is a professor at Sciences Po, prestigious French university. Welcome. Mr. Oldřich Dědek is a member of the board of the Czech National Bank, which is a central bank in our country, but it's his second term. He has served there also in the 90s, but in between he was he held a job of being like Czech coordinator of Euro for entering the eurozone, or which is, as we can see, is a never-ending story. So he has a more positive and more important position now. But he was Czech ambassador for the membership. So his most of his professional life he spent like with thinking about what this country should do, how it should enter. But it doesn't mean that we are anywhere close. Gabriela Cretu is a chairwoman of the European Affairs Committee in Romanian Senate, and Hani Sherman is an economist in European Central Bank in Frankfurt. So welcome all of you. In the introduction of the panel, you read what this is going to be about, so I would briefly introduce it with my words. One of the important questions is like how what should be how to strengthen the institutions of the eurozone, and is it going to happen, and is it going to happen soon? We all know that eurozone, if we compare it with other like long functioning monetary unions, only has a central bank, but is lacking other important instruments like some kind of a European, some kind of a eurozone budget, some kind of a eurozone taxes, some kind of a finance ministry or treasury, common deposit insurance scheme, and some kind of European taxes. On the other hand, like some people are much more patient, like as I know very well that my friend Mr. Dědek is one of those who's very patient. That the previous crisis created some important institutions and created some, so we have all these like firewalls we didn't have before. We have more clear competences of the central bank, etc. So perhaps next crisis would lead us to a little bit, or lead the eurozone to a little bit more integration. Also, the question is like if the eurozone can function without being a transfer union, or without being some kind of a mutualization of common guarantees of. Because currently it's a monetary union which is based, besides the central bank like an institution, is based on rules and penalties, etc. So is it sustainable into the future? We know the German and French position is quite different. We know that Italy is on the way, or now in this feverish time after the elections, Italy is promising to break the rules. or not to respect the rules. And last but not least, there is a situation of countries which are obligated according to the treaties to enter the eurozone at some point, like Czech Republic or Romania, and they are still not there, and actually are not even heading there. So we have all these important matters to discuss, and perhaps I would like to ask Mr. Landau first for his intervention. I would ask all the panelists to speak first for 5-7 minutes, then we would go into a discussion. So, Mr. Landau, please.
Thank you very much. When I read the first two sentences of the presentation notice, they said two sentences. The first one is that the eurozone can...
Excuse me, can you hear it? Could you? It's probably... Your microphone might be broken because I don't...
I may have broken it, yeah.
No, wait for a second.
Where is it? Here.
It's mute.
It's mute. No, it's okay. Oh, thank you very much.
So once again.
So let me read the first two sentences of the introductory notice, which said first that the eurozone can only be viable if countries are better off inside in the currency union than outside it, which makes sense. And I'll comment on that at the end. And the second one is very strong. It's in its current form, the single currency seems unsustainable in the long run. So, of course, I will not agree with that second statement, but rather than spelling out my disagreement, I think it would be useful to see how people who are very skeptical about the euro, what kind of reasoning they take. And in my view, there are two intellectual biases which can govern Euroscepticism regarding the euro, which you find both in policy statements and in academic statements. So the first one is that if it's not perfect, it's doomed, right? So to put it in economic terms, if the euro is not an optimum currency area, as economists say, therefore it's doomed, it's unsustainable. Now, I've read thousands of pages on US and more generally Anglo-Saxon literature, which condemn the euro area or are very skeptical. They can all be summed up. I mean, the Stiglitz books, the Modi book, every book, they can be summed up in these two sentences. It's not an optimum currency area, therefore it's doomed. Well, it's a little bit binary. You can be imperfect and not be doomed. And that's exactly what the euro area and the euro project in general is about. India is not an optimum currency area. It's a huge heterogeneous entity. China is not. So I think, obviously, the euro is not perfect. But saying it's not perfect and saying it's unsustainable are two different concepts. And this is a tendency of economists in general to think that because reality does not conform to their model and the perfect model, reality is wrong. But that's actually the contrary. Maybe the model is itself incomplete. And the second, which we see in the policy debate right now, is saying a sort of confusion of what would be advisable and what is necessary. So I think everybody would agree that a common budget would be advisable. Everybody would agree maybe that a common deposit insurance would be advisable. Everybody would agree that a common resolution fund would be advisable. Are they absolutely necessary today? And the distinction is extremely important because a lot of what is advisable may not be politically feasible. And so I think it's very important intellectually and politically to make that distinction. I'm very pro-European budget. I don't think it will see the day in the foreseeable future. I think the euro area can very well function without a European budget. I think the French president is very right to push for it. But it shouldn't be seen as a precondition for what's happening. And when we look at what is being said on the banking, for instance, and Mr. Chairman, you alluded to it, everybody says, okay, if we don't have the common deposit insurance, everything is finished. Well, 5 years ago, we didn't have the banking union at all. And so I'd rather look at what we have accomplished, which is a gigantic step. And I can tell you, I was in a government job at the time. The idea that France would agree to give up supervision of its own banks, it was totally heretical 6 years ago. Now it's commonly accepted. This is the biggest step in European integration, which has been made in the last 10 years, and it's been done very fast, in 18 months. 18 months between the moment the decision had been taken and there was detailed political and technical agreement on that. So it's a little bit strange to hear 4 or 5 years after that, oh, but we need a common deposit assurance. I agree it could be nice. I'm not sure it's absolutely necessary, personally. I don't understand the rationale for it very well. And we need a common resolution. So the important thing is to know, to wonder whether we have what is necessary right now. And of course, from my point of view, but that's of course something that not everybody will share, I think I would be happier with a stronger crisis management mechanism. A lot of improvements have been brought to the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism. I still think it's too weak for the kind of crises and shocks and financial shocks that we may have, and which nearly destroyed the euro area in 2012. So at the moment, those shocks are sort of softened and buffered by the extraordinarily easy monetary policy that we have in all countries. But the day where we hope we can normalize monetary policy in the euro area, we may need a stronger crisis fighting mechanism. And for me, that's where the emphasis should be right now in discussing the future of the euro area. And in general, I would end by 2 brief general remarks. The first one, if we go back to the whole history of Europe, right? The discussion always went be at 2 different levels. There was the grandiose and very inspiring political vision. And there was the detailed project. And I think the fathers of Europe have been very careful in not permanently establishing a relationship between the two, keeping the vision alive, but not condemning the vision because it hasn't been instantly realized in the fact. And I think that kind of, I would call schizophrenia in approach, is very healthy politically, because it keeps optimism. Whereas if you try to put the two at the same time, you become pessimistic. And my last remark is about the first sentence, which does make sense. A country should only enter the euro if they are better off inside or outside. The question, and of course it's up independently of the constitutional and treaty imperatives, it's up to each country to make their choice. The only sort of technical remark I would make is that you have to consider the horizon. And no monetary policy and no monetary regime is optimal at any period of time. So if I look now, I don't think any German economist would think that the monetary policy of the euro is optimal for Germany. Now, 5 or 6 years ago, it was not optimal for France or for Italy. So a monetary regime which is optimal at one certain period of time is not on the other end. But you have to choose. You have to choose. So maybe for some countries, staying outside of the euro is optimal at some moment, but not optimal at others. And so when you make that choice, the only sort of recommendation I would venture to make, when you make that choice, you really have to think about the long run, not the short run. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So I would ask now Gabriela here for her introductory speech.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of Euro reform, I'm very much interested actually in building a common understanding. This is the most difficult issue because solutions are easier after having a common understanding. As only elected representative in this panel, I would use the opportunity for having a more political approach and for asking some questions to my colleagues here. I am a realist utopian. Realist because of understanding, I mean, the real problems European Union is facing now, but dreaming still about a federal union. My critical approach, it is not at all a Eurosceptical one. The first main problem we are facing now is diagnosis. The second is uncompleted monetary system. Euro is a trust-based currency. Trust is a very variable indicator, requesting for automatic stabilizers and a genuine central bank with instruments of intervention in order to maintain economic balance in a democratic functional society. The creation of economic monetary system took away, as Professor said, from member states the majority of adjustment mechanisms. They have to be created at the European level, but there is no political will and understanding for doing it. I spoke about diagnosis being the worst because it depends on the theoretical model we assume. When this model is inappropriate, the result is wrong and misleading many times. By recently, every big economic crisis had changed the economic mindset. After the Great Depression, last century, laissez-faire was replaced by Keynesian policies and economics way of thinking. The stagflation in the 70s led to Milton Friedman monetarist approach, replacing Keynes for decades. After the catastrophic failure of the markets in regulating themselves more than 10 years now ago, almost nothing, not nothing, but almost nothing changed at this fundamental level. I have to remind here, not for experts, for the others, that there were at least 3 successive approaches concerning monetary system. In the 70s, it was seen as the natural outcome of the economic and political union. The McDougall report is already now somehow famous, spoke about 2.5 at the beginning and about 5 to 7% of GDP common budget in order to have instruments of intervention to be able to deal with imbalances. And the founders, we do believe, were very much aware about difficulties of achieving this result, but also about necessity and possibility. For comparing with Americans, for example, the dollar is supported by 23% federal budget with transfers of 10-12% and Fed. After '89, in a very optimistic moment for the markets, monetary union was imagined as triggering political union somehow. But Maastricht Treaty was dominated by great moderation paradigm, which means a simple, but unfortunately failing solution for macroeconomic stabilization, only targeting inflation, never unemployment, and fiscal public discipline without paying attention to fiscal policies or to private sector discipline. But 2004 came with a new political majority, offering legitimacy to a new direction. Monetary union without political union. Monetary policy has been immunized somehow against political decision-making, and social policies turned into adjustment variable. The new narrative, we know very well this narrative. Growth, competitiveness, flexibility, labor market rigidity, public debt, all neoliberal stuffs everybody knows. Moreover, with European semester, all this entered the legal system of our countries, at least, but all our countries, including those not being a member in eurozone, and are shaping our policies. Good ideas as social impact assessment were formulated, but not implemented so much. The European semester last year, only in 7% of social recommendation has been taken into account, 7%, only this level. So, first question. Social policies could be turned into an adjustment variable without political consequences, because between capitalism and democracy has already been a very delicate trade-off. It would be recommended in the future that economic integration to continue outpacing the political integration, as by now, the question refers to non-Euro member states as well. I ask because the business as usual approach wouldn't work for long if we want to keep the currency, the union, and democracy. We cannot have all three of them. And the current reform has been captive to the same paradigm as Maastricht Treaty. Enhanced fiscal discipline by establishing national buffers, so national public tool, increasing the resilience of the economy through structural reforms, a national private instrument, and a private risk sharing by completing the financial union. So, kind of European private instrument. No public European risk-sharing mechanism have been put in place, and the fact that a financial union deepens the gap, adding to labor force mobility, financial capital mobility from poorer regions to richer regions, hasn't been taken into account. Maastricht criteria at the political level haven't been challenged seriously, because the crisis has shown us what? That the model students, far from being protected, have suffered negative effects at an undeserved level. Here, Ireland, Spain are examples. That means that we promote a very limited understanding of discipline, or we have wrong understanding and indicators, because other member states, by far less attentive with strict criteria, easily coped with the crisis. Perhaps the balance of payments is much more relevant, especially since the surplus of one country is many times the deficit of another. I have one more question. Do you really believe that Europe could survive together with democratic society and its citizens without risk sharing? Because giving up democracy represents a sacrifice nobody here, I think, would agree with. And for concluding, we don't have a single currency, we have a common currency in an area with huge disparities, acting as a sponge, absorbing added value from the periphery to the center, or preventing to fill the gap. Economic divergences lead to political divergences and would destroy the union and sacrifice the citizens without a serious reform, I mean. Or, the last question, does we want a euro without a union? If we think of Soviet Union or even Czechoslovakia, it would be possible to keep euro when the union disintegrates, having a successor member states for the currency. But giving up the union would be a shame and a danger. A shame because of forgetting what important for peace and development was the Union and the danger because not putting something instead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Mr. Dědek.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me, yes, for this interesting panel. I will express some 3 ideas or 3 points. The first one is that each time I'm asked to speak about some visions, what the Eurozone should be or not, I feel a little bit uneasy. Because the Czech Republic adopted the wait-and-see approach. So we are waiting, so have a kind of right to advising as well. Okay, of course we can wait. Maybe the argument is that sometime in the future, non-Eurozone countries will adopt the euro, so they should have some say in the debates what the Eurozone will be. But now I see sometimes the problem that there is a clash between the long-term and short-term interest of non-Eurozone countries. As the longer-term interest, of course, we are heavily dependent on the health of the Eurozone. Therefore, everything which should add to the stability to the Eurozone should be welcomed in non-Eurozone countries. But from the short-term point of view, some measures adopted may seem a kind of discriminating the non-Eurozone countries. Let me give you some example from the recent days. So we know that there was a letter of the ministers of finance of the Eurozone, and as a result of this, the accession country should enter the banking union not upon entering the Eurozone, but earlier, yes, upon entering the ERM2 mechanism. From the longer-term point of view, from the interest of Eurozone countries, it seems to me a perfect rational decision. Because why should the Eurozone countries should be surprised that the banking sector has some problems when the country joined the Eurozone? It should be solved earlier, yes. But, you know, if you follow the debate in the Czech Republic, yes, you could hear that it's unfair treatment. There is nothing written in treaties that the countries should enter earlier the banking union and so on. So this is my remark that from time to time, yes, this clash appear. And my favorite point of view that we should prefer the longer term interest of the Eurozone, which stabilize the common currency. The second remark, I think that when we speak about the visions, yes, how the Eurozone should evolve, whether the Eurozone will survive the next crisis, my opinion is that the recent crisis wasn't the normal crisis. It was a kind of 1,000 flood water, which happens one times in 100 years, maybe. So it was really disaster. And I don't think that this very severe disaster will appear in a couple of next years. And I think that the Eurozone is resilient, yes, to normal, let's say, business fluctuation. But of course, it doesn't imply that we should not improve and debate what should be done. And in these debates, I have to confess that I'm a kind of traditionalist. We should not forget about the logic of Maastricht convergence criteria. As the idea was that only the countries with low inflation, sustainable public financings, stable exchange rates are fit and ready, yes, for joining the Eurozone. Of course, the crisis revealed that this is so-called necessary but not sufficient conditions, and many other institutions and ideas were adopted. But you know, the Eurozone is a kind of club yes, of countries where is, on the one hand, let's say Germany, yes, with a very strong stress on sound public policies, and there are some countries I would not like to name, which have problems, yes, with the logic of Maastricht convergence criteria. And for me, it's quite understandable, yes, why, let's say, Germany is reluctant to go ahead with some deeper reform if some other countries are blatantly refusing, yes, to adopt this fiscal discipline, because, you know, the problems will have implication for the banking sector. Yes, the health of the banking sector will deteriorate, and of course the Germans ask the question: should we pay for the mess, yes, created as a result of irresponsible policies? So it seems to me that we should not forget, because the Maastricht discipline is not panacea. Yes, that's true, but sometimes it seems to me that we are somehow losing some memories. Look, for example, there is a new stream, funny theory, modern monetary theory. Yes, it's really funny. Yes, what are the recommendations? Yes, we should abolish the Chinese wall between the central bank independence and the government. Okay, we should encourage as much debt as possible. So it's impossible, yes, to reconcile this theory. And I can imagine that this theory may have proponents in some countries. So from my point of view, what is really needed is so-called policy convergence. Yes, not only economic convergence, but also the policy convergence, that some common understanding what policies are needed to support a stable currency. Unfortunately, some countries, and this is my understanding why the crisis was so painful, that many countries learned this lesson, unfortunately, during very painful adjustment programs, which was really very difficult, but I think it's consequence of some previous unfair policies. So this is my point of view. I would not like to go some details. Of course, I fully support the idea that we should complete the banking union, that we should discuss about some fiscal capacity of the eurozone budget and so on. That's fine. Yes, these debates is a full, but without this having in mind, yes, some I would say the Maastricht discipline. Yes, I think that it's very difficult to move further on our way to complete more stable eurozone.
Thank you. So, Anne?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on such a high-level panel today to discuss what is, to me, certainly the central question of European economic integration, namely what it takes to make the euro sustainable, to ensure that it is and remains a success. In my intervention, which I shall add, does not necessarily reflect the views of the European Central Bank. I shall take a step back, and I would first like to highlight what the euro has already achieved before going into what's been done during the crisis to make it even more adaptable and where we stand today in terms of further reform needs that I'd see. So as I said, in many ways, I think the euro is actually already a success. So first of all, and most importantly, it has delivered on its core mandate, and it has produced 2 decades of price stability for the euro area. So average annual inflation right now across the euro area stands at 1.7% for the 20-year period since the euro's creation. Even in a country like Germany, that before joining the euro had very low and stable inflation, this is a significant improvement. Secondly, and while it may sound paradoxical, the euro has actually given to all of its members monetary policy sovereignty. Why is that? Because by pooling monetary policy sovereignty, all members now take decisions jointly on the best monetary policy stance for the euro area as a whole. And I think the fact that the euro has enlarged from 12 to 19 members since its foundation speaks to this point. Third, and relatedly, I think it's also not to be ignored that by abolishing exchange rate fluctuations, the euro allows all of its members to reap the full benefits of the single market and has safeguarded the integrity of the single market. So today, the euro area is highly integrated, and this is expressed through pervasive value chain integration across the euro area. And starting from already high trade integration, we now even see more intra-euro area trade than compared to the beginning of the euro. And finally, and I think this shouldn't be ignored, the euro is actually very popular with its citizens. So currently, support for the euro among the citizens of the euro area stands at a record high, and it's 3 out of 4 citizens that say they're in favor of the euro. So I think beyond these significant achievements, it should also be acknowledged that the euro area is in fact an evolving construction, and that it has changed and adapted considerably over the past decade in response to the crisis. When I look back upon my time in Brussels, that started in 2012, the euro area was beset with 3 acute problems. One was financial sector vulnerabilities, a second was weak competitiveness in a number of member states, and a third was sovereign strain in other member states, or partly overlapping. And I think right now we've come to a point where these acute problems have disappeared to quite a significant extent. So this is due to a lot of action taken on behalf of both the member states and at the European level. So importantly, member states have taken reforms to reduce the imbalances that made them vulnerable to economic shocks and led to the crisis. And in parallel, at the European level, we've seen a reinforcement and strengthening of economic policy coordination. We've seen the creation of the banking union that has made the European financial sector so much more resilient. And we have now a European stability mechanism, as was pointed out, that helps member states that are facing acute crisis deal with them. Yet, I would also argue that it is clear that in some member states, not all of the euro's benefits have materialized in full. And there's further measures that can be undertaken to help the euro deliver fully for all of its citizens. What do I think these areas are? I think first and most importantly, sound economic and fiscal policies still matter. They're the first line of defense for member states, and they're a main engine of income convergence in the euro area. Yet right now, we still see that in a number of member states, we have elevated levels of unemployment and low productivity growth and/or high public debt. At the European level, effective coordination mechanisms can actually help countries in these reform efforts. I think on the fiscal side, there's a strong case to be made for simpler and more credible fiscal rules. There's the easy principle that these rules should help member states build adequate fiscal buffers in good times so they have sufficient fiscal space to use in bad times to stabilize their economies. At the same time, I think there's further scope to help member states in the implementation of economic reforms. And as for instance, there's currently discussions on a common budgetary instrument for convergence and competitiveness to that effect. Other European level reforms for me clearly do actually include a European deposit insurance scheme that currently our banking union stands on 2 out of its initially foreseen 3 pillars. And in my opinion, that's important, especially from a consumer perspective, because the common insurance scheme could guarantee that deposits across the euro area are equally safe. And ultimately, this could foster a really single European market in banking services. Then, beyond this, and related to financial sector issues, is the European Capital Markets Union, which remains an unfinished agenda. So this would help diversify financing sources, and research shows that if you diversify financing sources, you actually help especially innovative forms of investment, which fundamentally then also help potential growth. But beyond that, Capital Markets Union can also stimulate cross-border investment, and that can be an important source of private sector risk sharing, as for instance we see it in the United States. However, even if I think we had a significant degree of private sector risk sharing, for me, I think that is not a full substitute for public sector risk sharing and stabilization. Rather, I think the two are mutually complementary and reinforcing. And so while the current discussions on the common budgetary instrument on competitiveness, on convergence are very good, they currently don't include a strong stabilization element as perhaps you might want to see, and it would have to evolve further in the future to that effect. Now I sit here and I discuss big reforms, and I'm a central banker, and the reforms ultimately are linked to a political process. I have one observation, namely that I think since we left this peak phase of the crisis that I experienced in Brussels for several years, there used to be a strong sense of urgency around EMU reform. And I think now we've moved into a phase where there's a less strong sense of urgency related to EMU reform, and attention in part has shifted to other policy areas. I think that should not mean, because we've overcome the EQ problems and EMU has proven quite adaptable, and you can actually work and function even if you're not perfect. And that might be an elusive quest in the first place. I think this elusive quest for perfection. But I think still it's very good to ensure that the EMU can deliver for all of its citizens in good times, carefully think this through, and get on the weatherproofing while the sun is shining.
Okay, thank you very much. So I would now have I would now ask all the panelists some question, and you can also react on whatever is on your mind, like what you heard from other speakers. But for Mr. Landau, I would ask. You spoke about optimal currency area. Perhaps more important is forget about optimal currency area, but look at the institutions, like what monetary unions which are functioning long term, what kind of institutions they have in place, and Eurozone only has this central bank, which until the crisis, this major crisis erupted, we even didn't know that this central bank can be a lender of last resort or final savior, or if it can do this whatever it takes, which we know that it can do this whatever it takes, which is a major change. But that's one thing. And other thing is like that it's okay to be imperfect and patient and to wait for another steps for some time. It's gonna take a long time, but will people and citizens of the Eurozone be patient enough? If they have an impression that the Eurozone might be somehow damaging, especially in some southern countries, economic growth, that it might have an impact on unemployment. So will people be patient enough politically for this little gradualistic approach, like that it could last centuries until until Eurozone develops all the necessary institutions?
Okay, these are very easy questions, of course, very easy to answer. No, they are very difficult ones. And so on the first point, yeah, as I said, I think you're right. If we look at the institutions, the ECB is working very well. The euro system is working well. I think it's a model of federal institution in the EU. I cannot think of an institution, I mean, all the money institutions of the EU work well, but this one works especially well, and it has been well designed. The fiscal thing, I think Mr. Dedek was very right in pointing that a lot of things which were in the spirit of the Maastricht Treaty have not been fully respected. And we have an institutional problem which is how to sort of coerce or coordinate fiscal policy of sovereign state. And it hasn't been solved. It's true, it hasn't been solved. The third point which you mentioned yourself is the crisis fighting mechanism and whether the central bank should act as a lender of last resort to governments, which is basically what you said. And here, it's true that we don't see eye to eye in the euro area on that. So to caricature the differences, If we see a problem on a sovereign debt, the German view would be, oh, it's a solvency problem, we have to address it by tough fiscal measures. And maybe the French view would say it's a liquidity problem, we had to address it by supporting the debt of the member state affected by proper liquidity provision. Right? And between those two visions, we have to find a balance, because we know that identifying in real terms the liquidity and the solvency component of a sovereign crisis is very difficult. And so when you start from different points, it's obvious that you may arrive at different conclusion. In my view, it's not finished, and the solution we have now is not perfect. I could elaborate on that, but I do think we need a more powerful mechanism to support sovereign debt crisis in the euro area. So I'm very much in favor of that. But of course, as Mr. Dedek said, for us to progress on that, we have to make sure that part of the Maastricht Treaty spirit on convergence is respected. So that would be my answer on your first question. Institutionally, things work reasonably well, but on the whole thing about the ESM and the crisis fighting mechanism, I would like something much powerful and maybe a little bit more flexible. The ESM now can only make their decision at unanimity. If you've gone through a financial crisis, you know that you have to make decision in 1 weekend. And 1 weekend with unanimity and sometimes with parliament approval, that may not work. So this is for me the real Achilles heel of the euro right now. Now, the second point is, are the Eurocitizens despaired? And if they are despaired, what to do about it? Well, they are not. I think the statistic that Mrs. Schulman quoted is absolutely right. 5 years, 6 years, or 10 years after the crisis, we have 75% of the Eurocitizens which support the euro, including in those countries which has gone through a very deep austerity adjustment program. So obviously there is no revolt against euro amongst European citizens. And the extreme right party, which campaigned in France 2 years ago against the euro, has dramatically reversed their stance because they knew it was not a vote-winning strategy. It was a vote-losing strategy. So I think we're under strong pressure to perform better in the economic field in the EU, and the citizens are maybe frustrated by that. But looking at the statistic and the number, they don't make today the euro responsible for that. And I would like to add two further comments. First, Mr. Schulman said we have regained monetary sovereignty. This is very important. Something, I'm sorry to be a little bit technical, something happened 3-4 years ago which was very important. For the first time in the last 40 or 40 years, the long-term interest rate in the euro area diverged from the US. Now, if you look at the graph, you see until 2014, 2015, the long-term interest rate in the euro area, including in Germany, were exactly the same as one in the US, which meant that actually the US monetary policy was driving the euro area, the Europe monetary condition, which was very bad because when the US was getting better and the Europe was not getting better, we had to sort of live with very high interest rates imported, so to speak, from the US. Now, you've seen in 2014-15 that there's a divergence. That divergence has, of course, a negative aspect to it. It means our growth performance is not as good as the US, but it also means that we are now able, owing to the euro, to have a monetary policy which is exactly fitted to our needs and our cyclical position, which is very new. That's what monetary sovereignty is about. And I think, if I can refer to my country, people are aware of that. They're aware they have the monetary policy which is adapted to their circumstances. And if we have our domestic currency, let's make a thought experiment. We have our domestic currency. Last Sunday, the most Eurosceptic party in France finished first in the European election. We would immediately take 200 basis points in our long-term interest rate, immediately. Or we would take a depreciation of the exchange rate. So we would have instant translation of any kind of political shock into our financial condition. The euro protects us from that, and it protects all of us from that. So it's about sovereignty, and it's about the ability to absorb shock, and I think people realize that. Mrs. Cretu mentioned a lot of very important things about the regional divergence, the increase in inequality, whether we can have a true community without risk sharing. I think these are very important questions for the future. I don't think they are specifically European. We have all those problems in other countries, advanced and emerging economies. I think we should debate it, but we should, because it's very important, and I don't have the answer to this question, but we should not debate it in a way which would sort of make the responsibility of, put the responsibility of existing arrangement. These are common challenges that all our societies are facing today, which some of them are the result of globalization, most of them. It's very valid and positive to debate of a common European response to those challenges. Conceptually and even politically, if I may say, I would not ascribe the responsibility to what's existing right now.
Thank you. I would like to ask Gabriela briefly. You are afraid how, or if I understand it well, that how eurozone would be, or euro or membership in the eurozone would be compatible with democracy in the future, or so. Or it might be complicated. So could you speak a little bit about position of your country as far as the eurozone membership is concerned, even though you don't represent the government, but the Senate?
No, but we work a lot on this issue because not being yet a member, we'd like to understand and to take the better decision. So I'd like to start by saying, continuing Professor, that a set of rules of institution could be good for something and wrong or not good enough for a different goal or a different reality. Or it's about my country, our country as well. We have actually now an economy without borders, being the single market almost completed, an internet-driven economy, and transnational corporations. Both three aspects that could demonstrate actually that we don't have economic borders. Instead, we have responsibilities and indicators with borders. Because there is this trend for replacing weakened solidarity between member states, a higher responsibility for each of them. And indicators we know very well. We use for convergence the GDP. But the GDP is a measure for something which happens in a country as Romania, not for something which belongs to Romanians. Almost 48% of our GDP is dependent on transnational corporations. And among indicators, there are now the assets, or the potential of development in the future depends on the wealth of a nation, of a society, on the assets, not on GDP, which is as well a variable indicator changing from 1 year to another and don't knowing always where actually finally would be in Cayman Island or somewhere else. Now the wise decision in Romania is to work on two levels. Domestically, to have policies in order to reduce inequalities between regions and between citizens, because unfortunately Romania is not the case for Czech Republic, but Romania has a high Gini level, inequality level. We have, I suppose, 35, 36, comparing with 24.5 in Czech Republic, for example. So, and a low level of income, that means everybody could feel the difference if it is a victim, not is rich enough to not perceive the change if a wrong change happens. Yeah, and we have as well a less wise decision to start preparing for entering in 2024.
Okay, for Mr. Dědek, briefly, you are defending the master criteria, the rules-based system, but who broke the rules first? These were the biggest countries, Germany and France, where the eurozone started to exist. And now there is a case, Italy, which is on the verge to break the rules. At least Salvini is enthusiastically announcing the breaking the rules. And with Italy, we know that it's a nice thing that it's too big to go bankrupt, and it's too big to be saved. So what's going to happen with such a big player also would start to disrespect the rules? So is it sustainable? Isn't it like too imbalanced to emphasize the rules only?
Of course, you are right. The European Union and the eurozone is still a club of sovereign states. So how we can penalize, yes, sovereign states? Of course, we have the rules, but in reality is very difficult. Yeah? So it seems to me that the European Commission was more courageous. Yes, now it's not so lenient with the Italian approach. Okay, so that's fine, but of course there are the limits. And actually, I don't know what would happen if the states would ostensibly decline to fulfill the rules. It would be the end of the eurozone, definitely. Yeah, so it's a key condition. Yes. So, and it's very difficult to find solution. And you are right that the sad thing is that the big states like Germany and France, okay, create some precedents. Okay, instead of complying with the rule, they rather trigger the debate how to reform the Stability and Growth Pact. It's sad. Yes, I think it created a lot of damage. But it seems to me that therefore I said that we need more policy convergence, that each government takes for granted that it's indispensable.
Okay, thank you. For Hani, I have a question. Like you said that membership in the eurozone provided the members, if I understand well, like with a long era of monetary stability and low inflation. But isn't it like a little bit thing of the past that last 10 years, like EU or Eurozone was struggling with deflationary tendencies, so after the crisis it probably wasn't so complicated. And second question, you said that even Germany is doing something or realizes that imbalances are unhealthy. So what exactly is Germany doing to improve these imbalances with its very strict constitutional fiscal rules, etc.?
So for the first question, I have to be careful because we have a governing council
Just
coming up
briefly,
next week, so we're just close to quiet period. But Jenny, I'd say it's of course true that the first 2 decades and with the euro very, very different characteristically and in terms of monetary policy challenges. But at the same time, we've also seen a notable pickup of inflation over the past few years again, and whereas like right now we're actually I'd say we're probably on a good way. I'll leave it there. And then under the second one, I'm working for an EU institution. I don't really know what Germany is planning, just because that's my nationality. So I would maybe come back to a more general point, and that's the point on institutions. And I think part of the spirit of the intervention I met earlier, and also coming back to the sort of what's advisable and what's necessary to have, I think there's a general observation to be made that throughout the crisis, the EU and the euro area probably fared best in areas where it had strong institutions. So one of them being my own institution, but also if you think of the policy areas of trade or competition that lie with the Commission, I think the EU has actually performed really quite well. And it just shows the power of having discretionary and trusted decision-making. And I think that's not to be underestimated in terms of how far that could get us.
Thank you. So we we have some question in the system here. So I would ask the panelists to respond in very briefly, in really like few sentences. We have a question about transformation of ESM, the permanent firewall, into European Monetary Fund. Is it going to happen, Mr. Lander, very briefly?
I hope so. I hope so. I wrote an op-ed 9 months ago in the FT saying I hope so. What should happen, in my view, is that it should become a monetary institution so that it has access to monetary resources. And second, that the majority decision would be replaced by a sort of weighted, qualified, unanimity decision, sorry, should be replaced by a qualified majority. Then you could move to the very healthy situation where the liquidity decision would be well articulated with the conditionality. I've served in the IMF like 25 years ago. The power of the IMF is that they can articulate liquidity provision with good conditionality. And at the moment, when you look at the OMT, for instance, the OMT is supposed to be, this is a program to support by liquidity, it's supposed to be conditional, and we saw during the Greek crisis that the ECB was deeply involved in setting conditionality for the Greek program. Well, in my view, it's not the job of a central bank to set conditionality for an adjustment program. That should be done by a different institution. But that institution should have access to monetary resources. So if we really want to have a European monetary fund, which would mimic at the European level the International Monetary Fund, which works quite well after 40 years or 50 or 60 years actually, then we should have that kind of arrangement. The problem that would cause, institutionally speaking, and I'm very sensitive to what Mrs. Cretu said, institutions should adapt to circumstances, absolutely, is that the Commission, who's now nominally responsible for the conditionality, this is the taboo, the elephant in the room, right? Everybody, I think, would rationally recognize that the ESM should have power to set the conditionality on its program. But at the moment, the Commission is mainly responsible for conditionality. So the elephant in the room is that will we have the sort of drive to move the conditionality function from the Commission to the ESM? I think it would be necessary. I think it does make sense to have the institution which grants the financing ultimately to set up the condition. I think it should neither be the Commission nor the ECB. That is not their job. And we have set up the ESM. And if we can manage to make it move in that direction, I would be very happy.
Thank you. Mr. Direk wanted to add something?
Only one remark. I mentioned some potential clashes between long-term and short-term interests of non-Eurozone countries and this transformation of European stability mechanism. Also, there is one potential clash. As you know, that The key question is, you know, the European Stability Mechanism took part in some adjustment programs, so there are some liabilities. And the key question is, if a new country joins the eurozone and as a result of this joins the European Monetary Fund, for example, should the country take over these responsibilities as well, even though it was not part of the decision-making body as when these loans were extended? So it's one very interesting point. There is a precedence, yes, when I think the Lithuania joined, okay, there was no rule exception that even though the Lithuania joined after some money were used in Cyprus, I think, and in Greece, so the Lithuania also assumed all old liabilities of the SMS. So I think that it will be this is a precedence probably will be required for other accession countries as well.
Thank you very much. So we have a question. Will the US dollar be replaced by another currency, meaning probably the euro? Will it ever compete with the dollar as an international reserve currency, for instance?
We have a traditionally neutral stance actually at the ECB on the international role of the euro because depending on the strength of a currency internationally, it comes with different pros and cons, and we've been neutral. But I would generally say that the more we strive for integration, economic and especially financial integration of the euro area, that would actually support and strengthen the international role of the euro. So especially banking union, but capital markets union are really important. It would definitely sort of increase the attractiveness of the currency and its international use.
Thanks, Mr. Land. I wanted to add.
I would support that fully, and maybe we should have insisted more on that in the discussion. But to be a global currency, you have to offer to international investors assets which are liquid and safe. And because the market is segmented, we cannot offer them that to the same extent that the US does. And so having both private and public assets which are not attached to a specific country, I think this is the major thing we should do in terms of the capital union. And in my view, the capital union exercise is too much oriented towards legal harmonization, which will take 30 years, 2 or 3 decades. It should be more oriented towards creating new financial instruments which are truly cross-border, which are truly Europeans, and that can be done, at least on the private side. The public side is more tricky, but we could have, if we, with a minimum financial innovation and a little bit of legal sort of inventivity, we could have asset-backed securities which would be reflective of a European risk, which would offer a truly European risk, a market instrument, and that would be a decisive first step in making the euro an even more global currency.
Thank you. So there is an important question. I think if Eurozone slides into recession within the next 12 months, what options does ECB have? It probably wants to emphasize that how far you can go with negative interest rates, like, or perhaps this spraying people with helicopter money, whatever these options, or giving money to the people, or so. Do you want to briefly?
We're almost in quiet period, and I'm not the monetary policy person in the bank, but I think we've been very committed, and I think we remain committed to ensuring that we deliver price stability.
Okay, do you want to react on this question?
So I came back to my first statement. Euro is a trust-based currency, and it is the currency of the European Union. As long as so many speak about European Union, disintegrated, Eurosceptical views, we undermine our own currency and its possibility of internationalizing, because nobody would check financial rules or the structure of the institutions. It's about trust that tomorrow this currency would keep the same. For this reason, we have to be aware, because it's more about policies, and it's a good question what to do if a recession would start, and functioning, than about creating new institutions. We have to change in policies something. With the current institutions, we could manage, not at least to be more flexible. On inflation level, 2%, why 2? Not 3 if there is possibility of growth, and 60% concerning public debt. Japan is surviving still with 200, I don't want to give this model, but however, for 20 years is in this situation, and nobody would say that Japan would disappear for this reason.
Okay, yes, just one sentence.
If I just might add, I think there's also an interesting, obviously, like some mutually reinforcing effects, because we've been talking about the EMU deepening and the further economic integration agenda. And I think generally it's very important to be aware that the smoother one part of the economy works, the smoother other parts of the economy usually can work. And one of the things is one of the examples is monetary policy transmission, clearly as well. So if we think about, for instance, structural reforms that member states can take, or if we think about resilient financial systems, that helps us transmit and deliver our monetary policy measures to the real economy. And so this is, it's basically two sides of the same coin, talking about EMU deepening and talking about the effectiveness of other instruments that we have in the economic and monetary union.
Okay, thank you very much. We have to finish because there is another program, so I would like to invite all of you, or remind all of you that there is going to be a closing speech in the main hall and a little concert, and then there is a reception or banquet. So I would like to thank all of you for coming, and all the panelists for their perfect contributions. It was really interesting, and see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, sir.